prospects of U.S. counter-narcotics programs. All of us know and agree that drugs represent a terrible scourge in the country. Lives are wasted and crippled to an enormous degree. And so the enterprise of dealing with that, both internationally as well as locally, is of tremendous importance. And we're very fortunate to have with us this evening to discuss the question the Acting Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, Mr. Paul Simons. Mr. Simons has a BA from Yale, MBA from NYU in finance. He was in the private sector and financial area for a number of years before joining the State Department in 1981. His assignments include being on the policy planning staff, being detailed to the Treasury Department, tours in Africa and Latin America, and very interestingly, from '96 to 2000, Director of the Office of the Peace Process and Regional Affairs in the Office of Near Eastern Affairs. Extraordinarily interesting job, an important job in a critical period of time. He then served in 2000 to 2001 as Deputy Chief of Mission in Tel Aviv. I can see where the questions might go tonight. And then came back to Washington, serving in his present office, first as Deputy Assistant Secretary, then Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, and now Acting Assistant Secretary. The topic is wonderful. We have one of the authoritative voices. We're absolutely delighted to have with us Mr. Paul Simons.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here this evening to talk a little bit about our counter-narcotics and law enforcement policies. The Bureau that I represent manages about $1 billion of annual foreign assistance that supports promoting U.S. counter-narcotics and law enforcement objectives overseas. We have a dual mandate. Our traditional involvement has been on the counter-narcotics side, largely in Latin America, and we continue to spend approximately 70% of our resources in the Andean region, which of course is the source region for 90% of the cocaine that reaches our shores, as well as a large percentage of the heroin. But since 9/11, our Bureau has also been called upon to meet the broader challenges of strengthening the law enforcement institutions in some of our key partner countries around the world, which have asked us for help, specifically Afghanistan, Pakistan, Indonesia, and now the Philippines. We have recognized that weaknesses in police departments, in police structures, in border security structures, have a real impact on the ability of these countries to cooperate with us in the war against terrorism. So we're pursuing basically a two-pronged focus in the Bureau, and I'll try in my remarks to talk a little bit practically about what we're doing on the ground, how we spend the taxpayers' money. But essentially, we're looking at practical problems to attack the supply side of the drug equation, as well as practical initiatives to bring the expertise that U.S. law enforcement agencies have abroad, largely in technical assistance, training programs, and the provision of commodities to support law enforcement institutions in some of our key partner allies. So those are the missions that face our Bureau. We're located in the State Department, but we serve as the eyes and ears of the law enforcement community as it affects diplomacy. So we interact with all of the domestic law enforcement agencies, and we provide them funding. So the Customs Service, FBI, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, all of them receive funding, and in many cases got their start interacting with foreign countries through our Bureau and through the State Department. A lot of the U.S. law enforcement agencies overseas have not historically had a large presence. Of course, this is changing after 9/11, but a lot of the change after 9/11 is on the operational side. The FBI will go out and send a team of agents for the Philippines to work on cases. What we do in INL is take the training side, take the folks who work at the FBI Academy, take the trainers who work at the Treasury's Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia, take those people and deploy them overseas to conduct training courses and to basically get involved more in the long-term institutional development of law enforcement overseas. We are hoping, and we believe strongly, and Congress also believes, reflecting in the amount of funding that we're getting, that this effort is essential to build up the law enforcement capabilities of our partners. So what I thought I would do in this speech is talk a little bit about what we're doing in one key country in Latin America, which is Colombia, a country I know quite well. I served there early in my career. And talk a little bit then about what we're doing in Afghanistan, which is another key priority post 9/11. And that might give you a little bit of a flavor of where the taxpayer resources are going and what sorts of practical initiatives we are implementing on the ground. In Colombia, we are spending approximately $400 million a year in foreign assistance to counter the drug trade. The initiative was built up actually during the Clinton administration and was put together by the former Colombian president, President Pastrana. He recognized that to counter the drug trade, you needed a multifaceted initiative in Colombia that would attack drug cultivation. Colombia is now the world's largest grower of coca and one of the largest growers of opium poppy. To counter the trafficking side of the equation through support for what we call interdiction operations, and also to provide some economic alternatives to Colombian farmers who have gone into the coca growing business. That's the third pillar. And the fourth pillar is institutional strengthening of the Colombian legal system, judicial system, armed forces, to give them the capabilities to stand up to these threats. So we're working in a wide variety of programs in Colombia. It's a multifaceted program. All of it's run through the State Department. Our primary focus is on the eradication side of the equation is a program of aerial spraying of herbicides on the Colombia coca crops. This is a program that we don't undertake anywhere else in the world except for Colombia at this point. Most of the other countries in the Andes as well as in Asia that are large cultivators of drug crops have taken a different approach to their eradication challenges. Most of them have gone and paid people to manually cut down the crops. But in Colombia, we have a peculiar situation. The drug trade is largely financed by terrorist organizations. The FARC and the paramilitaries are very heavily involved in financing the drug trade. There is very limited security on the ground in the rural areas in Colombia, making on-ground kinds of eradication operations very difficult to conduct. And coca itself, the coca leaf, is not a traditional product. It's not it's not a part of Colombian culture the way it is in Bolivia and Peru. The peasants in Colombia have not been growing coca for hundreds of years. Basically, the decision to go into coca production was a business decision that was taken by the Colombian traffickers who, during the period of the 90s, found it difficult to continue to procure their raw material, which was the coca leaf, from their traditional sources in Peru and Bolivia. So as they found this more difficult, they basically chose to downstream into the leaf business itself and to essentially recruit large numbers of Colombian peasants to deforest large areas of the Colombian plains and to enter into large-scale industrial plantations of coca. And to some extent, this took place without the knowledge of the United States, without the knowledge of the Colombian government, because these areas had been essentially off limits and out of the reach of the security authorities, and to some extent out of the reach of our technical means for detecting the location of the coca crops. So from the period of the mid-90s, when Colombia virtually imported all of its coca leaf, in a period of 5 or 6 years, Colombia now imports virtually none of its leaf, and all of it is grown locally. It's been a massive expansion. Today, Colombia, the acreage sown in coca is approximately 120,000 hectares a year, which is far larger than the coca grown in Peru and Bolivia. So as I mentioned, our focus is on our aerial eradication of Colombian coca. Our second focus is on interdiction, which basically refers to blocking the supplies at various points in the chain, on the rivers, in the oceans, utilizing technical means and utilizing financial support that we provide to different elements of the Colombian military. We also provide support for alternative development projects which attempt to lure Colombian coca growers out of the coca business. We recognize that the financial payoffs that one can receive through alternative livelihoods will never equal the financial payoffs from coca, but nevertheless, we and the Colombian government believe there has to be an effort made to develop some alternative income sources, which, when combined with the eradication and the interdiction efforts, can be helpful in getting people to stop growing coca. And we're also working on institution development, as I mentioned, strengthening the capacity of judges, the judiciary, the legal system, and the police and the military. It's a major, continues to be a major policy objective of the U.S. government to advance our counter-narcotics efforts in Colombia. Colombian President Uribe, recently elected, has a strong commitment to counter-narcotics and to wiping out the terrorist threat in Colombia. President Uribe was visiting Washington in the last couple of weeks, has, I believe, enjoyed a very favorable reception, both on the part of the executive branch and on Capitol Hill. And we look forward to working with him to advance our counter-narcotics objectives in Colombia. This is obviously a difficult problem, hard to resolve. The absence of security in the rural areas is a particularly difficult impediment to making progress. By contrast, in Peru and Bolivia, we've had rather substantial progress in the drug war over the past decade. Peru has seen its cultivation of coca drop by more than 2/3, and Bolivia by about 4/5. You can see the same combination of elements in both countries, a strong commitment to eradication. Peasants have to know that it is illegal to grow coca and that the government will come in and forcibly remove their crops if they don't move out of cultivation. In both Peru and Bolivia, it was the implementation of firm eradication policies that really enabled the governments to turn the corner on the cultivation. And in addition to eradication, strong programs of interdiction and alternative development, which help provide alternatives to the farmers. So we are hopeful that some of the successes that we've had and lessons that we've learned from Peru and Bolivia can be extended to the Colombian case. But there are deeply rooted problems in Colombia related to the insurgency, related to the absence of historical government involvement in the rural areas, that's going to make this a major and a multi-year challenge. But we look forward to working with the Uribe government to beginning to turn the corner during his administration on this issue. In Afghanistan, our challenge was quite different. We had had no recent historical involvement in the narcotics trade there. Afghanistan, during the Taliban period, had grown to be the world's #1 source of opium poppy. And during the Taliban, opium cultivation was legal and expanded rapidly, such that by the year 2000, Afghanistan was producing about 70% of the world's opium. In fact, that most of the heroin from Afghanistan was flowing to the neighboring countries, to Pakistan and Iran, to Europe, and to Central Asia and up to Russia, and was creating major public health problems in a lot of these countries. Only a relatively small fraction of the Afghan opium comes to the U.S. Perhaps 5% of our supply comes from Afghanistan. But the Taliban did gain substantial resources from the opium trade, and after 9/11, the view in the U.S. government was that the return of Afghanistan to its prior position as a major opium producer could be extremely destabilizing to the country, to the region, to the sub-region, and to our ability to work with the Afghan government in a constructive way. So we began working closely with other members of the international community to put into place a counter-narcotics initiative in Afghanistan. And the British, under Prime Minister Tony Blair, took the lead. Prime Minister Blair had a strong personal commitment to the fight against Afghan heroin, and our government believed that it was appropriate, entirely appropriate, that the Europeans, who were the major recipient country for Afghan opium, be the lead country. But we worked closely with the British. I personally spent a good portion of this past spring working with them to devise a multi-pronged program to get a handle on Afghan opium production. It's a major challenge because the agricultural sector in Afghanistan is completely flat on its back. There's been 20 years of civil war. Opium was the only crop that really was a very reliable source of income for the peasants there. And it was also the only crop that could get them credit to get through the winter. The brokers would essentially advance credit through the winter to be repaid through the spring opium crop. In addition to that, the tools that we have available in most other countries where we've had successful counter-narcotics policies, including in Pakistan, tools such as government security presence in the rural areas, organized law enforcement, interdiction squads, intelligence networks. None of this is in place in Afghanistan. So at the same time that we were assisting the government in building up its capability, we had an immediate challenge of finding ways to make sure that the opium trade did not reignite. We were only partially successful, and I think this is going to be a multi-year process. The British this spring, with our assistance, did succeed in working with the new Afghan government to eradicate a portion of the opium crop. The government also declared opium illegal and has run a pretty strong moral campaign against its cultivation. The government also shut down all of the open-air opium markets and stalls, and has been pretty aggressively, with the cooperation of the British, going after some of the heroin laboratories. But it's going to be a long-term effort. We have asked Congress for additional supplemental monies, which we received in the counterterrorism supplemental 2 months ago. And we have a program that will begin to deliver resources into the poppy growing areas, into alternative livelihoods. And we've begun to implement that program. And we're building roads, we're building clinics and schoolhouses, and providing other kinds of employment opportunities. But security in Afghanistan, as in Colombia, in the rural areas, is very limited. And so our ability to function on the ground in the kind of way that we were able to, say, in Pakistan or in Bolivia and Peru, is limited. And until such time as the government really gets a good handle on security in the rural areas, it's going to be very difficult for us to fully accomplish our objectives. But we are working hard at it. We're also using some of our supplemental resources to build, with the cooperation, in this case, of the German government, an Afghan police force. The former Afghan police force was decimated during the period of the Civil War. We are trying to recreate it, to retrain the police, to train counter-narcotics specializations, to provide equipment, to stand up police force. And we're also providing funding through the UN for institution building to rebuild a counter-narcotics capability within the Afghan government, to create a national drug strategy, to create public awareness programs that can begin to steer the Afghan public against drug cultivation as well as drug consumption. We have major challenges in Afghanistan, have major challenges in Colombia, major challenges all over the world in using our resources effectively to counter the drug threats, as well as what I mentioned before, some of the broader law enforcement challenges. I could talk for considerably longer, but because I'm fascinated by this topic, but I think I will stop there and open it up to your questions. Thank you very much.
Well, we thank you for a comprehensive overview. The floor is open for questions. Yes, ma'am. Is there not only an alternative crop, is there an alternative food source to quell hunger?
I'm aware only that this is an issue to some extent still in Bolivia. And Bolivia, because there have been traditional uses for coca there, Bolivia still licenses about 12,000 hectares a year of land to be used for what they call legal coca uses. And they have an agency that attempts to monitor, to make sure that this coca goes in to what's called licit uses, which include the preparation of coca tea and other coca products. Now, when you chew coca leaf or you put coca into coca tea, it's a very low dosage and it really doesn't have the same kind of narcotic effect as a processed cocaine. But I think to address the other concern that you raised, Peru and Bolivia are both embarked on other kinds of longer-term development initiatives that are designed to, get these countries out of poverty, and we're assisting them by providing alternative development resources. We're putting about $30 million into Bolivia this year, and we've actually been fairly successful in Bolivia in developing some agricultural products because, unlike in the case of Colombia, where the land that they're using for coca production was basically it was basically forest. It was not prime agricultural land. In the case of Bolivia, it's very good agricultural land, and we have been able to develop with the Bolivians some useful alternative products, bananas, pineapples, some of them for the Argentina market. So there have been some income-generating possibilities, and this is an issue that we're continually seized with and working on in all the countries that we work.
Would you comment on your colleagues' efforts on the domestic side to cut out consumption?
Right. On the domestic side, there are a lot of initiatives underway. They're coordinated by the President's Office of National Drug Control Policy. There's a major public affairs campaign going on now. You can see the advertisements in the Washington Post, I'm not sure, in the Baltimore papers, on the television, oriented at youth consumption issues. So I think that the public diplomacy aspect of our domestic campaign is very important. But at the same time, where the international side, the supply side and the demand side come together, where the rubber hits the road are on the issues of price and purity. And to the extent that we can be even somewhat successful, even marginally successful in a country like Colombia, there will be an impact on the price in the U.S. and on the purity, and that will, statistics have shown that will drive a lot of the initial users out of the market. So that's what we really, in a way, the statistics, I come, as Dr. Bird announced, I come a little bit with an economics financial background. This job frustrates me because the statistics are all like jelly, because you're dealing in an illegal commodity. The estimates of the volumes of cocaine shipments have huge orders of magnitude of error associated with them. But the statistic that doesn't lie is the price and the purity, because that ultimately explains whether or not you are succeeding. And I think this is where we have to measure our effectiveness. I'm hoping, I mean, in the case of the last few years, what's happened in cocaine is basically that Peru and Bolivia have become very marginal suppliers to the U.S. market, but Colombia has made up the difference. So what we've done is we've basically succeeded in cleaning up a lot of the problems in Peru and Bolivia and have enabled those societies really to move forward as non-narco economies, which is a major achievement. And in terms of the whole rule of law and the whole way these societies function, they're kind of de-narcoized from where they were a few years ago. We have to consolidate that progress. Colombia, of course, we still have a huge problem. But if we can make progress in Colombia and hold to the consolidation in Peru and Bolivia, we will see impact here on price and purity, and then we'll start to see that ought to, this is the virtuous cycle, that ought to help also drive people out of the market here. The international community has a totally different approach to the drug problem today than it did 10 years ago. 10 years ago, it was viewed as a U.S. problem. Now you go to meetings in Asia, and the Asians are extremely concerned about methamphetamine consumption in their own countries. It has affected the elites. It's affected the children of the elites. And this has basically driven these countries to attack, in a very aggressive way, the supply situation in ways that they weren't prepared to do before they had their own domestic demand problem. Some of the other countries we believe are still in the denial phase. They have major demand problems, but they're still in denial. Countries like Brazil and some of the European countries. But the Asian countries are not in denial, and the Latin American countries, many of them are not in denial. They recognize that it's in their own self-interest to also go after the supply, whether it's the cultivation phase or the transportation, the transit phase. Countries like Pakistan and Iran have been decimated by the Afghan opium. The statistics in Iran of the number of opium in heroin addicts are in the 2 to 3 million category. Pakistan also in the millions. The situation in Russia is totally alarming. All the HIV/AIDS in Russia is being spread by heroin intravenous users. It's a frightening problem. They have public health problems around the world in many of these countries dwarf the drug problem that we have in this country, and have enabled us to garner international support for this drug effort. It isn't difficult to speak on this issue in international audiences. It's a very welcome attitude. People want to hear also what we're doing on the demand reduction side. They want help. They want to know how they can educate their people. Not that we have all the solutions on this, but they're very open to exchange experiences on how we can work together to bring demand down. In terms of where we are on price and purity, there are some troubling trends. There are definitely some troubling trends there, both with respect to cocaine as well as with respect to heroin. For a number of years, the purity, largely the price hasn't changed too much on either of these products, but the purities, and particularly with heroin, have been going up in the last few years. With respect to cocaine, of course, there was a huge decrease in demand about 10 years ago, and it's kind of plateaued since then. There haven't been huge changes in either price or purity since then. It's been pretty static. There's some evidence that DEA has put forward within the last year that we're starting to see some measurable decreases in purity of cocaine. But I wouldn't want to necessarily point to a trend there. We're still, I think in general in cocaine, we're kind of fighting to stay even. But we're also, the other measure that we look at is seizures, and we are, by aggressive interdiction, we're seizing about 30% of the cocaine that we think is coming into this market. So we're kind of fighting to stay even, and we're making some progress, but we're struggling to stay even. And so from the perspective of the State Department, we've always viewed that to some extent, the area in the supply chain where it is least difficult to make progress, I shouldn't say easiest, because none of these are easy, but it's least difficult to make progress, is right at the cultivation stage. So that is why we are pushing very hard on this aerial eradication program in Colombia, as is the new Colombian government. We are hoping to eradicate this year about 120,000 hectares of cocaine. The problem in Colombia has been that traffickers have been very clever, and they have been replanting almost as fast as we can spray. Now, when you replant, it still takes 9 months to a year to get the new bushes into cultivation. But this Colombian government wants us to step up the pace of aerial eradication. And it has been demonstrated in the past that where we eradicate twice within 1 year, we have been able to kind of break the will of the growers. So this is what our goal is over the next year.
Question is, why not just buy the crop?
You know, this is an idea that's come up, and we considered it very seriously with respect to the Afghan crop, in particular in the 1 year. The problem with buying the crop is that it carries what we call a moral hazard. To some extent, it could encourage people to grow more, could encourage people to grow more the next year. unless you make it very clear that it's a one-time only operation and you're not going to repeat it. It requires a lot of resources, and there are always leakages. So it's an idea that has been out there. It's been given actually pretty serious consideration in the administration. We actually happen to have a legislative restriction that prohibits us from doing this in our permanent law, but we think actually that if we found a situation in which it made sense, we could get Congress to waive that. And we were looking very seriously at doing this in Afghanistan. To some extent, the British did this past year because their eradication campaign was accompanied by some payments that went along with the eradication. So it could be viewed in part as a crop buyback. But there haven't been any real good examples in the past of these buybacks being terribly successful. And if you look at the countries that have been able to completely stamp out their illicit crops, the best examples are Pakistan and Thailand. They've had fantastic, and these are poor countries, Pakistan in particular. They've had very, very, very successful programs. It's really been countries that have pursued this diligently over a period of 10, 15, 20 years, have put alternative development programs into place, and largely have sent the military out, sort of conscripts out there whacking the stuff down. And in the case of Pakistan, people are growing onions instead of onions and cardamom. Not real high-value crops, but they can make money on it. It's not subsistence crops. I think subsistence crops don't tend to cut it. You're never going to equal the income that you make with the drugs, but you've got to find something that is something of a cash crop that has more than just a subsistence value, or you're not going to win on the economics.
I believe the general question is, are the billions which you spent futilely expended? The specific question is, why not fund studies of the problem?
Right. Right. Well, I think this is an issue which has been debated a long time in this country, and I think during the 70s there was a fair amount of thinking that moved in the directions you cite. I think that the public mood shifted pretty radically in the early 80s for a combination of reasons, crack epidemic among others. I think it's largely, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's kind of a moral issue for the politicians, and to some extent a moral issue for people like myself that have small children that would be absolutely horrified by the thought of a culture which somehow provided some kind of endorsement in whatever fashion to narcotics use. I think there are a lot of people in this country who simply find the idea morally repugnant, and for that reason the discussion stops there.
Would the war in Iraq have an impact on your efforts?
We're a pretty small cog in the overall process as far as the State Department goes, although we do have about $1 billion a year, which is out of the $16 billion in total foreign assistance. We're around 6%, so we're not insignificant. I think that the impact of the war, of the situation in Iraq, actually my guess is that our Bureau could well get involved as we did in Afghanistan, assuming that there is some kind of post-crisis, I guess we don't like the word nation building, but I'll use it anyway, nation building exercise. We'd probably actually get involved in designing and helping to develop some of the legal instruments in Iraq. providing some advice on how to put together a judicial system, court system, penal system, some kind of law enforcement structure. So I think actually we'd probably be rather actively involved there in terms of the Bureau. I don't think our broader efforts would be too affected. We have experienced a situation in which some of the operational U.S. law enforcement agencies have had to, and the intelligence agencies, have had to divert some of their personnel and resources away from the drug war in favor of the war against terrorism. So there has been, some impact in terms of the operational agencies, and that could well continue to the extent that the war on terror is a multi-year sort of effort that continues to consume the energies of our law enforcement community. So we could see, some erosion on that side, but I don't think it would have a huge impact on our programs.
Two questions, I think, at least. And one is, do the funds get diverted to the wrong people supporting other efforts other than dealing with narcotics? And in the process, do the producing peasants get hurt in some way?
On the question of human rights, we have an ongoing dialogue with our congressional oversight committees, and our Bureau, I think more than any other bureau in the State Department, keeps an extremely close eye on and does vetting of the actual units that we work with. We do human rights vetting with all of the police units that we work with to ensure that the people that receive our funding are not associated with any human rights violations. So that's a condition of our aid, which we take very seriously, and we have programs in place all around the world. In the case of Colombia, for instance, we can only operate with a very limited number of Colombian Army units that are human rights vetted. There are only 3 or 4 units that we can associate our funding with. All the rest of the Colombian Army we can't deal with. We can't fund them. These guys can't use our helicopters, use any of our aid. So we're very attentive to this, and we have an ongoing. I go up to meet with our congressional oversight committees and talk about these issues all the time. So we're very seized with these issues on human rights. On the issue of the effectiveness of the program, I think that we ultimately do have to measure our performance by the price and purity. And so to that extent, I think we have to stand up and be counted. To some extent, our results up to now have sort of moved the chess pieces around on the board. I don't think that's necessarily such a bad thing. If you go to Peru and Bolivia and take a look at how different those countries are now than 5 years ago, it's quite remarkable. Or even look at a country like Thailand, where we've been working for 30 years, and our investment has very substantially paid off. There's very little Burmese heroin used to be primary source of heroin to the United States. There's very little Burmese heroin now that transits Thailand en route to the U.S. Because of the infrastructure and institutions that we've been able to build up with the Thai. So we actually have had some successes. Now, to some extent they've been offset. And I mean, look at the Colombians. Look at the heroin production in Colombia. It's very entrepreneurial. There was never a history of opium cultivation in Colombia, never. The Colombian traffickers built this industry utilizing the marketing chains that they set up for coca. And they backfilled, developed a poppy industry from nothing. And developed into the largest supplier of heroin to the East Coast of the U.S., and some people would say to the entire country. So these people are very entrepreneurial and present major challenges, not all of which we have been successful in defeating yet.
The question is, what is the percentage of the U.S. population which is addicted, and how has that been measured and developed over time?
There are various surveys that are done by the Department of Health and Human Services to measure drug use in the U.S. The best known one is called the National Household Drug Survey. It comes out once a year. It recently came out. And it's done nationwide sort of sampling. I have to confess that I have not read the one that came out within the last few weeks, but my recollection is we have about 2 million regular users of cocaine, somewhere around that area, somewhere around 500,000 regular users of heroin in the country. I don't believe those numbers have substantially changed for about the past decade. I believe regular user is defined as, but I don't want to be held to these numbers because I don't have them in front of me. A regular user is, I think, defined as a user in the past 30 days. Again, I don't think those numbers have changed substantially, but there are a lot of issues of concern. The issue of concern, the purity of heroin, is an issue of huge concern. The issue of methamphetamines, the availability of low-cost synthetic drugs. It's very possible that the drug-producing countries decide that it's just too much of a nuisance to cultivate coca and opium poppy. There are too many climactic conditions. It's too easy to eradicate. And that these countries decide to go in a large scale for the production of synthetic drugs. This is what has happened in much of Asia. So in China, the main drug problem, although they have a huge heroin problem from the heroin in Burma, the major drug challenge is methamphetamines. In Japan, it's methamphetamines, and these are very hard to interdict. This could be a huge problem on our borders. We have the problem of ecstasy, which is growing, a major challenge. So there are the new drugs, the boutique drugs, major challenge that for people that are sort of in this traditional business as we are, kind of going after cultivation, going after traditional trafficking patterns, it's very difficult to stop the flow or the production of these synthetic drugs, many of which are produced in developing countries, developed countries themselves. They don't require a lot of transport. We can look at precursor chemicals, but even that is difficult to interdict. A lot of these precursor chemicals have legitimate uses. So these are some of the major challenges ahead.
Which country might be the example of success?
Say the countries that I've worked with. Thailand's probably the best model. Thailand was a historical producer. It was a poor country, historical producer of opium poppy. It began 30 years ago on an aggressive program that combined eradication effort with a very creative alternative development effort. Now, Thailand was uniquely successful because they were able to find products, really high-value products, that could feed in, agriculture products could feed into the tourism trade, could feed into hotels, things like this, vegetables, cut flowers. And so they were able to make a huge progress in the rural areas. Plus, they developed infrastructure and institutions. They have an interagency system in Thailand, cooperation between the Narcotics Bureau, the police, and the military. It's really quite extraordinary. They've done very good work on money laundering. We're very concerned about what happens with drug flows. They have a good money laundering law, which they're beginning to enforce. They're working on developing their legal system in ways which make it easier to prosecute and to put drug dealers into jail. They have worked with us extensively on intelligence sharing. So they've been basically able to kind of take the Burmese heroin and move it up to China. Now, it may, it may just be sort of moving the boxes around, but it's had a very, very salutary effect on that country. At the same time, now they have a huge methamphetamine challenge, so they're confronting the domestic demand problem too. But they've done a good job, and I think the corruption, although there's still corruption in Thailand, but there's nowhere near the levels of corruption that there would be if Thailand was still a major cultivator of drugs. So that's one of the success stories. Pakistan is the other one, where it's a very, very poor country with huge corruption problems, a huge domestic consumption problem of hashish, largely Afghan, but they have completely wiped out their opium production, and they were one of the world's major growers of opium for many, many, many years. And it's purely because of political will. The government decided some 20 years ago that they did not want that stain on their reputation. So they push very hard. We have supported them financially. We continue to support them in terms of providing funding for alternative development. And they turn the corner. And the other experience that we've had is once countries wipe out cultivation, they don't want it back. There have been few incidences of backsliding. Or countries that have never had it, like Ecuador, surrounded by countries that have cultivation. They've never had it. You talk to the Ecuadorian military, you talk to any of the politicians in Ecuador, this is one of their greatest sources of pride. These countries do not want the level of drug-induced corruption that goes with being a cultivation country. They don't want it. It's not because we tell them they don't want it. They recognize that it's in their own interest to keep the cultivation out.
Two questions. Mr. Shore would like to know whether you'd like to have tobacco added to your list of charges. And the second question is, if it's not being done, is that because our tobacco industry is too powerful politically?
In order to get the sort of international cooperation that we've been able to obtain in attacking the drug trade, we have relied on the international community to speak with one voice. And this voice actually is expressed textually in a series of UN conventions on narcotic drugs that go back about 40 years. And so this is really the sort of international law that undergirds our operation. If you look at the basic law that created our bureau and the standards that Congress laid out for our operations and the process we go by every year, we go through a certification process where we basically sort of tell countries whether or not they're cooperating with us. But the standard that is measured is whether or not they are fulfilling their commitments under these international drug conventions. And these drug conventions do not cover tobacco. And I think that really it would be a major leap. And I don't know how we could really function internationally the way we have if we really didn't stick pretty carefully to the mandate, the international mandate that we have.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground, and we're absolutely delighted that you've joined us tonight, and it's very generous of you to share your expertise with us. We're sorry we don't have more time, and I apologize to those of you who still had remaining questions, but we do thank you very, very much.